I heard my husband laugh in Spanish and call me a pathetic old woman. And he had no idea I understood every single word. I didn't flinch. I didn't look up from my plate. I just lifted my glass of water, took a small sip, and let the sound of their laughter settle into something colder than anger. It was a quiet Tuesday evening, the kind that used to feel safe in a house we had lived in for over 30 years. The dining room lights were warm, casting soft shadows across the polished oak table Richard had insisted on buying back when we first renovated the place. I remembered how proud he was that day, how he ran his hand across the surface and said, "This is where we'll grow old together." I suppose he was right, just not in the way I imagined. Isabella sat across from me, perfectly composed, her manicured fingers resting lightly against her wine glass. She had that effortless elegance people admire without questioning too closely, the kind that hides intention beneath charm. Richard leaned slightly toward her, his voice lower now, but not low enough. "No tiene idea," he said with a smirk, and she let out a soft, amused breath. She thought it was harmless, I suppose. A private joke in a language I wasn't meant to understand. What they didn't know was that I had spent 2 years living in San Diego in my 20s, working in a small legal office where Spanish wasn't optional, it was necessary. I learned to listen before I learned to speak, and I never forgot either. "It's almost embarrassing," Isabella added quietly, her tone light but sharp underneath. I placed my fork down gently, aligning it with the edge of my plate the way I always did. My hands were steady. That surprised me more than anything. I had expected shaking, maybe even tears, but instead there was a calm I didn't recognize. A stillness that made everything around me feel distant, like I was watching someone else's life unfold from across the room. Richard reached for the breadbasket, completely at ease, completely unaware that the foundation of his carefully constructed lie had already cracked. He glanced at me briefly, offering the same distracted smile he'd been giving me for months now. Returned it. Not because I meant it, but because I needed him to believe I did. That was the moment I understood something important. This wasn't just about betrayal. It was about assumption. They had already decided who I was in this story. The aging wife. The oblivious woman. The one who would never see it coming. I picked up my napkin and dabbed the corner of my mouth, taking my time, letting the silence stretch just enough to feel intentional but not enough to raise suspicion. Inside, every word they had spoken replayed with perfect clarity, each one sharper than the last. I could have said something then. I could have looked Richard in the eye and answered him in flawless Spanish, watched the color drain from both their faces. But I didn't. Not yet. Because in that moment I realized something else. The truth wasn't my weapon. Timing was. And for the first time in a very long time I was willing to wait. I woke up the next morning at exactly 6:15, just as I had for the past 32 years, even though there was no longer any reason to keep that kind of schedule. The house was quiet, but it was not the peaceful kind of quiet I used to cherish. It felt different now, heavier, as if every room had absorbed something it could not release. I moved through the kitchen with practiced precision, filling the kettle, measuring coffee grounds, setting 2 mugs on the counter out of habit before pausing and placing one back into the cabinet. That small correction felt louder than anything they had said the night before. Richard came downstairs around 7, dressed earlier than usual, his tie already in place. He glanced at me, offered a quick greeting, and reached for his keys without finishing his coffee. There was a time when he would linger, when mornings were slow and filled with small conversations that did not seem important at the time. Now everything about him felt efficient, rehearsed, as though he was moving through a version of our life that no longer included me. I watched him leave through the front window, noting how quickly he got into his car, how he checked his phone before even starting the engine. I did not need to guess who he was. Messaging. I cleaned the kitchen slowly, deliberately, letting each task stretch longer than necessary. The rhythm helped me think. Every word from the night before replayed again. But now they settled into place alongside other moments I had ignored. The late nights that became routine. The sudden business trips that never used to happen. The way he stopped asking my opinion on anything that mattered. It had not started last night. It had simply revealed itself. By mid-morning, I found myself standing in the hallway outside his office, a room he had become increasingly protective of over the past year. The door was closed, which was unusual when he was not home. I stood there for a moment, listening to nothing, feeling that same calm settle over me again. Then I turned the handle. The room smelled faintly of his cologne, mixed with something sharper, unfamiliar. His desk was organized, almost too organized, as if he had made a point to remove anything that did not belong. But absence can be as telling as presence. I sat down in his chair and opened the top drawer. Inside were neatly stacked folders, labeled in his precise handwriting. Financial statements, investment summaries, documents I had not seen in years, despite the fact that we had always managed everything together. I flipped through them carefully, my fingers steady, my breathing even. It did not take long to notice the changes. Transfers I did not recognize. Accounts that were not in both of our names. Amounts that were large enough to matter, moved quietly over time in a way that would not draw attention unless someone was looking for it. I was looking now. I closed the drawer and leaned back slightly, letting the information settle. This was not impulsive. This was planned. Carefully, patiently planned. I stood up and walked toward the bookshelf along the far wall, running my fingers along the spines until I reached the small leather box we had kept there for years. It held copies of important documents, things we both agreed should always be accessible. I opened it and immediately saw what was missing. The original deed to the house was gone. I did not react. I simply closed the box and placed it back exactly where it had been. For a moment I stood there in the center of the room, taking in the space that had once felt shared and now felt staged. Then I walked out, closing the door quietly behind me. Back in the kitchen, I poured myself another cup of coffee, even though it had gone cold. I did not warm it. I sat at the table and stared out the window, watching the light shift across the backyard we had spent decades building together. There was no anger, not yet. Just clarity. They thought I was unaware. They thought I would remain that way. And that belief, more than anything else, was what would cost them everything. I did not call anyone that afternoon, and I did not confront Richard when he returned home that evening as if nothing had shifted beneath our feet. Instead, I observed. That became my role, not the wife who asked questions, but the woman who noticed everything and said nothing. He walked in just after 6, loosening his tie the way he always did, placing his briefcase by the door with the same quiet care. There was a time when I would have greeted him with a question about his day or a comment about dinner, but that night I simply looked up, offered a small smile, and returned to folding the dish towel in my hands. He hesitated for half a second, just long enough for me to see it, then continued as if that pause had never existed. Isabella did not come that evening, but her presence lingered in subtler ways. In the way Richard checked his phone more often than usual. In the way he stepped out onto the back patio to take a call he described as work-related. His voice low, measured, careful. I could not hear the words, but I did not need to. I had already heard enough. Dinner was quiet, almost polite. We spoke about neutral things, the weather, a neighbor's new fence, a television show neither of us had been paying attention to. It felt like a performance, one we both understood without acknowledging. I matched his tone, his pace, his detachment. When he excused himself early, claiming he had emails to finish, I nodded and continued clearing the table alone. The sound of the plates against the sink seemed sharper in the silence. After he went upstairs, I dried my hands slowly and walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room where we used to keep household records. Most of it had been moved over the years, consolidated into digital files I no longer had access to, but some things remained. Old checkbooks. A folder with tax returns from years ago. I opened each one carefully, not searching for anything specific at first, just reacquainting myself with the patterns we had once followed together. Back then, everything had been transparent. Every expense discussed, every decision shared. The contrast was not dramatic. It was subtle, which made it more deliberate. I turned on the small lamp and retrieved my laptop, something I rarely used for anything beyond emails and the occasional news article. That night, I logged into the bank account we had always used for daily expenses. The balance was lower than it should have been, but not alarmingly so. Small discrepancies can hide larger ones if they are spaced out over time. I began scrolling through the transactions one by one, tracing the flow of money the way I used to when balancing our accounts years ago. There it was again, that same pattern I had seen in his office. Transfers that appeared routine at first glance, labeled in ways that would not draw attention. Consulting fees. Maintenance costs. Vague enough to avoid questions, consistent enough to suggest intention. I wrote down the dates, the amounts, not on the computer but on a piece of paper, something tangible, something that could not be altered with a password. My handwriting was steady, precise. Each number felt less like a discovery and more like confirmation. Around 8:30, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Richard came down, already in more comfortable clothes, his expression relaxed, almost content. He asked if I wanted to watch something together, the way he used to on ordinary nights. I looked at him for a moment, studying his face as if I were seeing it clearly for the first time in years. Then I nodded. We sat side by side on the couch, the television casting soft light across the room, but I did not follow the story on the screen. I followed him. The way he shifted slightly when his phone buzzed. The way he angled it away from me before checking the message. The faint smile he tried to hide. It was all there, laid out in quiet gestures that would have meant nothing to me before. At one point, he laughed softly at something unrelated, and for a brief second, it echoed the sound from the night before. That same tone. That same distance. I felt something settle into place inside me then. Not anger, not sadness, but something far more useful. Understanding. When the show ended, he stretched and said he was tired. I agreed, turning off the television and following him upstairs. We moved through the routine of the night as we always had, brushing teeth, turning off lights, slipping into bed on opposite sides without speaking much. He fell asleep quickly, his breathing steady, untroubled. I lay there awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail of the past 2 days. Not as scattered memories but as a sequence. A structure. A plan that had been forming long before I noticed it. And as I lay there, listening to the quiet rhythm of a man who believed he was in control of everything, I made a decision just as quietly. I would not interrupt their story. I would let it unfold exactly as they intended. Because the longer they believed I did not understand, the more they would reveal. And when the time came, I would not need to raise my voice at all. The next morning arrived with the same quiet precision, but something inside me had shifted just enough to make everything feel sharper, more defined. I moved through the house with intention, not routine, noticing details I had overlooked for years. The faint scratch along the hallway wall from when we moved in our first piece of furniture, the slight creak in the third stair that Richard always promised to fix but never did, the way the morning light fell across the dining table we once filled with laughter. Memory has a way of softening the past, but clarity removes that softness. It replaces it with something cleaner, something more honest. I found myself standing in the living room, looking at the framed photographs that lined the shelf. There we were. Younger, smiling in ways that felt effortless and unguarded. A beach trip in Santa Monica, our arms wrapped around each other, sunburned and careless. A holiday dinner surrounded by friends who have long since drifted away. And then a more recent photo, taken just a few years ago, where the smiles were still present but something behind them had already begun to fade. I studied that one longer than the others. It was subtle, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. The distance had not appeared overnight. It had been growing quietly, patiently, just like everything else. I picked up the frame and held it for a moment before placing it back exactly where it had been. Nothing about this house was accidental. Not anymore. By late morning I decided to leave, something I had not done impulsively in years. I drove to a small cafe about 15 minutes away. A place I used to visit when I needed time to think. It had not changed much. The same worn wooden tables, the same soft music playing in the background, the same familiar scent of coffee and baked bread. I ordered a black coffee and sat near the window, watching people move through their day without knowing how quickly everything can shift beneath them. I took out the piece of paper from the night before and read over the numbers again. Dates, amounts, patterns. It was no longer just suspicion. It was structure. And structure can be understood, traced, dismantled. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone, scrolling through contacts I had not called in years. One name stood out immediately. Daniel Harper. He had been our attorney for nearly 2 decades, a man who believed in details and did not miss much. We had not spoken since the last time we updated our estate documents, a process Richard had insisted was complete. At the time I had trusted that. Now I was no longer interested in trust. I pressed the call button and listened as the line rang, steady and measured, until his voice answered with the same calm professionalism I remembered. I introduced myself, and there was a brief pause before recognition settled in. We exchanged a few polite words, but I did not waste time. I asked if he would be available to review some documents with me, emphasizing that it needed to remain confidential for now. There was another pause, longer this time, not out of hesitation but consideration. Then he agreed. We set a time for the following day. I ended the call and sat there for a moment, letting the decision settle. It felt different than anything I had done so far. This was no longer observation. This was movement. When I returned home that afternoon, the house was empty, but it no longer felt like something I needed to fill. Instead, it felt like something I needed to understand completely. I walked back into Richard's office, this time without hesitation, and began looking deeper. Not just at the obvious files but at the spaces in between. The second drawer beneath the desk, the one that required a slightly firmer pull. Inside, tucked beneath a stack of old documents, was a thin folder that did not match the others. No label, no markings. I opened it carefully. Inside were copies of agreements, signatures I recognized and others I did not. Changes made without discussion. Adjustments that shifted control in quiet but significant ways. My name appeared less frequently than it should have. Isabella's name appeared more than it had any right to. I closed the folder and placed it back exactly as I had found it, aligning every edge, every paper until it looked untouched. Then I stepped back and looked around the room once more. This space, like everything else, had been designed to keep me at a distance. To keep me uninformed. To keep me small. I walked out slowly, closing the door behind me with the same quiet care I had used before. In the hallway, I paused for just a moment, not out of uncertainty but acknowledgement. The life I thought I understood had been carefully rewritten without my knowledge. But they had made one mistake. They had assumed I would never read it. I arrived at Daniel Harper's office 10 minutes early the next morning, something I had always done out of habit, but this time it felt less like courtesy and more like preparation. His office was on the third floor of a modest building downtown, the kind of place that valued discretion over display. The waiting area was quiet, furnished with neutral tones and neatly arranged magazines that no one ever seemed to read. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, not out of nervousness but focus, replaying everything I had seen, every document, every number, every word spoken in a language they thought I did not understand. When Daniel stepped out to greet me, he looked exactly as I remembered. Calm, observant, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. He led me into his office and closed the door behind us, creating a space that felt contained, private, and controlled. I handed him the notes I had written, along with copies of the documents I had quietly taken photographs of the night before. He did not react immediately. Instead, he read carefully, his expression neutral but attentive, occasionally adjusting his glasses as he moved from one page to the next. The silence stretched, but it did not feel uncomfortable. It felt necessary. When he finally looked up, there was a shift in his expression, not surprise but confirmation. He asked a few precise questions, each one direct and measured. When did I first notice the discrepancies? Had I signed any recent documents without reviewing them fully? Did I have access to all current accounts? I answered each question without hesitation. The more we spoke, the clearer the picture became. What Richard had done was not reckless. It was methodical. Gradual transfers, subtle changes in ownership structures, quiet adjustments to legal documents that shifted control without drawing attention. And Isabella was not incidental. Her name appearing in those agreements was not a coincidence. She had been positioned deliberately. Daniel leaned back slightly, his fingers resting against the edge of his desk as he considered everything. Then he explained in the same steady tone exactly what it meant. Portions of our shared assets had already been moved beyond my immediate reach, but not beyond challenge. Some documents could be contested, especially if they were signed under misleading circumstances. Others would require a more strategic approach. Timing, he emphasized, would be critical. Acting too soon could alert Richard and give him time to reinforce what he had already put in place. Waiting, on the other hand, would allow us to gather more evidence, to build a case that was not just reactive but decisive. I listened without interrupting, absorbing each detail. This was no longer just a personal betrayal. It was a structure that needed to be understood completely before it could be dismantled. Daniel asked if Richard knew that I was aware of any of this. I shook my head. That answer seemed to settle something. Good, he said quietly. Then we proceed carefully. He outlined the next steps in clear terms. I would continue as I had been, observing, documenting, not confronting. He would begin reviewing the legal framework, identifying vulnerabilities, preparing responses that could be executed when the time was right. There would be no sudden moves, no emotional reactions. Only precision. When the meeting ended, I stood and thanked him, not with relief but with clarity. As I walked out of the building and into the late morning light, I felt the weight of everything settle into something steadier, something more controlled. I was no longer reacting to what had been done. I was preparing for what would come next. When I returned home, Richard was already there, something that did not happen often during the day. His car was in the driveway, his presence inside the house immediate and noticeable. I stepped through the front door and found him in the kitchen, his posture slightly tense, his attention shifting toward me the moment I entered. For a brief second, there was something in his expression I had not seen before. Not guilt, not exactly. Awareness. As if he sensed something had changed, even if he could not yet name it. He asked where I had been, his tone casual but edged with curiosity. I answered simply, saying I had gone out for coffee. He nodded, accepting it but not fully dismissing it. Isabella's name appeared in a message that lit up his phone on the counter, and he turned it over quickly, a small gesture that spoke louder than anything he could have said. I moved past him without pause, setting my bag down, removing my coat, continuing with the quiet rhythm of the house. But now, everything had a different meaning. Every glance, every movement, every word carried weight. They still believed I was unaware. And that belief, as Daniel had confirmed, was the one advantage I needed to keep. The following days settled into a rhythm that looked ordinary from the outside but felt anything but. I moved through each morning with the same measured calm, preparing coffee, opening windows, letting fresh air fill rooms that had begun to feel staged rather than lived in. Richard adjusted to my quiet presence without question, perhaps even with relief. There is a certain comfort people find in believing nothing has changed, especially when they have something to hide. I allowed him that comfort. It made everything easier. Isabella's presence became more visible as the days passed, though never openly acknowledged. She called more frequently, her name appearing on his phone with increasing boldness, no longer disguised behind vague labels. Sometimes he would step into another room to answer, other times he would simply lower his voice where he stood, trusting that I would not notice or understand. But I noticed everything now. One afternoon, while he believed I was upstairs, I remained at the base of the staircase, just out of sight, listening as his voice shifted into that familiar tone he reserved for her. He spoke in Spanish again, softer this time, but clear enough for me to follow. He talked about timelines, about needing to finalize certain documents, about how things would be simpler once everything was in place. Isabella responded with a light laugh, the same one I had heard at the dinner table, and asked if I suspected anything. Richard's answer came without hesitation. No tien idea. He said again, the same phrase, the same certainty. I closed my eyes briefly, not out of pain but recognition. They had repeated the same mistake, believing that repetition made it true. I stepped away quietly, returning to the kitchen before either of them could notice anything out of place. Later that evening, I sat at the table with my notebook open, adding to the list I had started days before. Dates, times, fragments of conversations, patterns that were becoming clearer with each passing hour. This was no longer scattered evidence. It was a timeline, a structure that revealed not only what they were doing but how long they had been doing it. The following morning, I made a small but deliberate change. I began asking questions again, not direct ones but casual, almost forgettable observations slipped into conversation. I mentioned the bank, wondering aloud if we should review some of our accounts since it had been a while. Richard responded quickly, too quickly, assuring me everything was already handled, that there was no need to worry. His tone was light, but there was tension beneath it, a careful balance between reassurance and control. I nodded, letting it go, exactly as he expected me to. That was the point. Every reaction, every word, every pause was measured now. I was not testing him. I was confirming what I already knew. That afternoon I returned to his office once more. But this time I was not searching for new information. I was verifying placement, memorizing where everything was kept, how it was arranged, what had been moved since the last time I looked. Even the smallest detail mattered. The angle of a folder, the order of documents, the absence of something that had been there before. People who believe they are not being watched often become careless in ways they do not recognize. By the end of the week, the pattern was undeniable. Calls increased. Transfers continued. Conversations became more confident, less guarded. They believed they were approaching the end of something, that whatever plan they had set in motion was nearing completion. And in a way they were right, but not in the way they expected. On Friday evening, Richard suggested we go out to dinner, something we had not done in months. His tone was unusually warm, almost attentive, as if he were trying to recreate something that had already been replaced. I agreed without hesitation. The restaurant was familiar, a place we used to visit on anniversaries and quiet celebrations. It felt almost symbolic now, though I doubted he saw it that way. We sat across from each other, the same arrangement as always, but the space between us felt entirely different. At one point, his phone buzzed softly on the table, and he glanced at it before turning it face down again. A small gesture, practiced, controlled. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and realized how certain he was of everything. Certain that I did not understand. Certain that he was in control. Certain that whatever came next would unfold exactly as he intended. I offered a small smile and reached for my glass, taking a slow sip as the thought settled clearly in my mind. The more certain they became, the less careful they would be. And that was exactly what I needed. By the following week, everything had begun to align with a precision that almost felt inevitable. Patterns that once required careful attention now revealed themselves effortlessly, as if the truth had grown tired of hiding. I no longer needed to search for evidence. It presented itself in the open, disguised only by their confidence. Each morning I added to my notes with quiet consistency, documenting not just what they did but how they did it. The timing of calls. The language they chose. The subtle shifts in Richard's behavior when he believed I was not paying attention. There was a rhythm to it, and once I understood that rhythm, I could anticipate what came next. Daniel called midweek, his tone calm but more focused than before. He had reviewed everything I had provided and confirmed what we both already suspected. The transfers, the documents, the quiet restructuring of assets. It was all intentional and carefully executed. But it was not flawless. There were gaps. Moments where haste had replaced caution. Where assumptions had taken the place of verification. He explained that those gaps would be enough, if handled correctly. We spoke at length about timing, about positioning, about the importance of allowing Richard to continue without interruption. The more complete his plan became, the more exposed it would be. I agreed without hesitation. Waiting was no longer difficult. It had become part of the strategy. That same afternoon I made another adjustment, one that seemed small but carried weight. I stopped initiating conversation. Altogether. Not out of withdrawal but clarity. I let Richard fill the silence if he chose to, and when he did, I listened more closely than ever. Without prompting, people often reveal more than they intend. He spoke about work, about future plans, about opportunities that would require change. The word change appeared more frequently now, always framed in a way that suggested progress, improvement, something inevitable. I nodded when appropriate, asked simple questions when necessary, but never challenged, never redirected. He needed to believe that his version of events was intact. That belief was becoming his greatest vulnerability. Isabella's presence grew bolder as well. She no longer limited her calls to late evenings or private moments. There were times when her voice carried through the phone clearly enough for me to hear from across the room. Her tone light, confident, almost celebratory. Once, as I stood near the kitchen doorway, I heard her ask in Spanish if everything was ready. Richard responded with quiet assurance, mentioning that he would soon take care of the final details. I did not move. I did not react. I simply memorized every word, every inflection, every pause. That phrase repeated in my mind long after the call ended. Final details. It suggested an endpoint. A moment they were working toward with certainty. That was the moment I needed to be ready for. Later that evening, I returned to my notebook and began organizing everything differently. Not just as a timeline but as a sequence of actions and intentions. What had already been done. What was currently in motion. What they were planning next. The clarity of it all was striking. For years I had believed that trust was the foundation of a life built together. Not confront. Not yet. He emphasized that when the moment came, it needed to be decisive, leaving no room for recovery or explanation. I left his office with a sense of calm that felt almost unfamiliar in its strength. This was no longer about uncovering the truth. That part was complete. This was about control. About ensuring that when everything surfaced, it would do so on terms they had not anticipated. When I returned home that evening, Richard was in the living room, reviewing something on his tablet. He looked up as I entered, offering a smile that felt rehearsed, as though he had practiced it enough times to make it convincing. I returned it without hesitation. There was no need to change anything now. Not yet. The house felt the same as it always had, but I no longer moved through it as someone who belonged unquestioningly. I moved through it as someone who understood exactly what it contained. Every room, every object, every detail carried new meaning. And as I stood there, watching Richard return his attention to the screen, completely unaware of how much had already shifted, one thought settled with quiet certainty. They believed they were approaching the end of their plan. But in reality, they were only now stepping into mine. It happened sooner than I expected, though in hindsight, it had been building toward that moment with quiet inevitability. On Saturday evening, Richard told me we had been invited to a small gathering at a colleague's home. Something informal, nothing elaborate. His tone was casual, but there was a carefulness beneath it, as if he had rehearsed the invitation before saying it out loud. I agreed without hesitation, already sensing that this was not simply a social event. When we arrived, the house was warm and well lit, filled with low conversation and the soft clinking of glasses. People moved easily through the space, exchanging polite smiles and familiar greetings. I followed Richard inside, noting how his posture shifted slightly, more alert, more aware. And then I saw her. Isabella stood near the far end of the room, her presence composed and effortless as always, dressed in a way that drew attention without appearing to seek it. When her eyes met Richard's, there was a brief pause, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. They did not greet each other immediately. They did not need to. Everything between them was already understood. I moved through the room with the same calm I had carried for days, greeting others, accepting a glass of wine, allowing the evening to unfold naturally. I did not approach her, and she did not approach me. Not at first. It was only later, as conversations shifted and small groups formed and dissolved, that we found ourselves within the same circle. Someone introduced us, though the introduction felt unnecessary, almost performative. Isabella smiled warmly, extending her hand with practiced ease. I took it, matching her expression, holding her gaze just long enough to acknowledge what neither of us said. Richard stood nearby, his attention divided, his confidence intact. He believed he controlled the narrative of this room, just as he believed he controlled everything else. At one point the conversation turned to travel, to languages, to the small details people share when they want to appear interesting without revealing too much. Isabella mentioned growing up speaking Spanish, her voice light, inviting. Someone asked if anyone else spoke another language, and for a moment there was a pause, the kind that invites a response but does not demand one. I set my glass down carefully on the table beside me and turned slightly toward her. "I understand Spanish," I said, my voice calm, measured, carrying just enough to settle the conversation without raising it. The shift was immediate, though subtle to anyone not paying attention. Isabella's smile held for a fraction of a second longer than it should have, then softened into something less certain. Richard's posture changed, almost imperceptibly, his shoulders tightening, his focus narrowing. I continued without hesitation, my tone steady, my expression unchanged. "I have for many years." There was no accusation in my voice, no anger, no explanation. Just clarity, the kind that leaves no room for interpretation. The conversation around us resumed, though with a slightly altered rhythm, as if something had shifted beneath the surface that others could feel but not identify. Certainty, and that shift, though quiet, was significant. I prepared breakfast as I always did, placing his coffee on the table without comment, taking my seat across from him with the same composed calm I had carried for days. Neither of us spoke at first. The silence was not uncomfortable, but it was no longer neutral. It carried weight, the kind that settles between two people who understand more than they are willing to say. Eventually, he cleared his throat and mentioned that he had a meeting later that afternoon, something important that might take longer than expected. His tone was careful, almost rehearsed, as if he were testing how much I knew without asking directly. I nodded, offering no resistance, no curiosity, no reaction beyond acknowledgement. That was enough. After he left, I did not remain in the kitchen. I moved with purpose, collecting the documents I had organized, the notes I had refined, the evidence that had taken shape over the past days. Everything was clear now, not just in fragments but as a complete structure. When I arrived at Daniel's office later that morning, there was no need for extended explanation. He had already prepared what was necessary. Papers were arranged neatly across his desk, each one representing a step forward, a correction, a response to what had been done without my knowledge. He walked me through each document carefully, ensuring that I understood not just what I was signing, but what it meant. Control of certain accounts would be secured immediately. Legal challenges would be filed in a way that prevented further movement of shared assets. Temporary restrictions would be placed where necessary, quietly but effectively. It was not dramatic. It was precise. That was the point. When I signed the final document, I did so without hesitation. The act itself felt simple, almost understated, but the impact was anything but. It marked the moment where everything shifted from preparation to execution. As I left the office, the air outside felt lighter, though nothing about the situation had become easier. It had simply become defined. That afternoon, I returned home before Richard, placing my bag in its usual spot, setting everything back into its familiar order. When he arrived, there was an energy to him that felt different, less controlled than before. He moved quickly, checking his phone, pacing slightly, as if something was not aligning the way he expected. He did not mention it at first. Instead, he asked about my day, his tone casual but strained. I answered simply, offering nothing that would disrupt the moment he was already experiencing. It did not take long. Within minutes, his phone rang again, and this time he did not step away. He answered where he stood, his voice low but urgent. I did not need to hear the other side of the conversation to understand what was happening. His responses were enough. Questions layered with confusion. Statements repeated as if repetition might change the outcome. A shift from certainty to uncertainty that he could not mask. When the call ended, he looked at me, really looked at me, as if trying to measure something that no longer made sense. I met his gaze calmly, without challenge, without explanation. There was no need for either. He asked if I knew anything about what was happening, the words careful, controlled, but edged with something sharper beneath. I held his gaze for a moment, just long enough to let the silence settle between us, then spoke in the same steady tone I had used all along. I understand more than you think. Nothing else. No accusation. No detail. Just the truth stated plainly. The effect was immediate, though quiet. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough to reveal that the balance had changed completely. He did not press further. Perhaps he understood that there was nothing left to confirm. Over the next hour, the house filled with a different kind of silence, one that no longer belonged to me alone. He moved through the rooms with less certainty, his actions no longer guided by the confidence he had relied on for so long. I remained where I was, seated at the table, my hands resting lightly in front of me, watching as everything he had constructed began to unravel without a single raised voice. There was no confrontation, no dramatic reveal, just consequence unfolding exactly as it should. By evening, the calls had stopped. The messages had slowed. Whatever structure he and Isabella had built was no longer intact. Not because it had been exposed publicly, but because it had been interrupted at its core. When I stood to leave the room, I did so without looking back, moving through the house with a quiet certainty that had taken time to build. At the doorway, I paused for just a moment, not out of hesitation but acknowledgement. They had believed I did not understand. That belief had guided every decision they made. And in the end, it was the one thing they never questioned. I stepped forward, leaving the room behind, knowing that everything they thought they controlled had already slipped beyond their reach.